In the heart of the American Midwest, there is a specific kind of morning. It's a time when the world feels newly born, characterized by the rhythmic lowing of cattle and the smell of damp earth. On June 10, 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, should have woken up to that familiar hum of rural life. But at the corner of East 2nd Street, the Moore household remained trapped in a different kind of time. Mary Peckham, the neighbor next door, was the first to feel the shift. She was a woman of routine up at 5, laundry on the line by 7. Usually, by this hour, the Moore family was a whirlwind of activity. Josiah would be heading to his implement store. Sarah would be tending to the garden, and their 4 children would be a chorus of laughter and slamming screen doors. But today, there was nothing. No smoke rose from the chimney. The chickens remained locked in their coop, protesting with a frantic, muffled clucking. Most unnervingly, the house itself looked blind. Every single window was covered not just by curtains, but by dark cloths and clothing pinned from the inside, as if the home was trying to hide from the sun. When Mary knocked, her hand hit the wood with a hollow thud that seemed to vanish into the house. No footsteps answered, no voices called out, just a suffocating, heavy silence that felt like a physical weight pressing against the porch. By the time Josiah's brother, Ross, arrived with a spare key, the air in the neighborhood had curdled. He stepped onto the porch, his boots echoing with a sharp, lonely sound. He turned the lock. The door didn't creak. It swung open into a gloom so thick it felt cold. He stepped into the parlor. The atmosphere inside was stagnant, carrying a faint, metallic tang that Ross couldn't yet identify. He struck a match, the tiny flame flickering against the shadows. As he moved toward the guest bedroom, he noticed the mirrors. Every reflective surface in the house, the vanity, the glass on the wall, had been draped in gray fabric. It was as if someone had spent hours ensuring that no one, not even the dead, could see what had happened in the dark. Ross pushed open the bedroom door. The flickering light caught the edge of a bed. He didn't see the faces they had been covered with bed sheets. He only saw the stillness. A stillness so absolute, so unnatural, that his breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to see more. He backed out into the morning light, his face ashen, his voice a ghost of itself. Because in that house, the silence wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a witness. This wasn't just a crime. Something about it was deeply unsettling. To understand the tragedy of Villisca, you have to understand the people who lived there. In June of 1912, Josiah Joe Moore was a man who seemed to have it all. At 43 years old, he was a sharp-dressed, successful businessman who managed the local implement store. He was the kind of father who provided not just a house, but a home. His wife, Sarah, was 39, a woman whose life revolved around the soft light of the Presbyterian church and the bright eyes of her 4 children. The Moore kids were the heartbeat of that home. There was 11-year-old Herman, the eldest, Mary Catherine, age 10, Arthur Boyd, who was 7, and little Paul, just 5 years old. They were bright, energetic sparks of life in a town that prided itself on being the safest place on earth. That Sunday evening was the pinnacle of their year, the Children's Day program. Sarah had spent weeks coordinating it. The church was packed with the scent of lilies and the sound of children reciting verses. Among the crowd were 2 visiting friends, 12-year-old Lena Stillinger and her 8-year-old sister, Ina. They were farm girls from just outside of town, excited for a rare Sunday night sleepover at the big house on 2nd Street. Witnesses later remembered the walk home. It was around 9:30 p.m. The air was thick and humid, typical for an Iowa summer. They walked in a happy cluster, 8 people laughing, talking about the program, their footsteps clicking rhythmically on the wooden sidewalks. They passed under the glow of the street lamps, eventually disappearing behind their front door. They locked it, as they always did. They felt secure. They felt loved. But behind the scenes of this peaceful Sunday, a predator was already in place. While the Moors were singing hymns at church, someone had entered their home. This intruder didn't come for money. He didn't come to steal. He climbed the stairs to the dark, cramped attic and sat there in the sweltering heat. He waited. He listened to the family return. He listened to the floorboards creak as they brushed their teeth and tucked the children into bed. He waited until the house fell into the heavy, rhythmic breathing of deep sleep. Nothing about that night suggested what was coming. There was no thunder, no warning, just the terrifying reality that while 8 innocent souls dreamt of tomorrow, a man was standing in the shadows of their own hallway, gripping an axe that belonged to Josiah himself. The warmth of that church service was about to be replaced by a cold, unimaginable nightmare that would haunt the American psyche for over a century. We are just scratching the surface of this mystery. If you want to see the evidence for yourself, make sure to turn on the notifications button and subscribe to this channel. The final moments of the Moore family's life were ordinary in a way that is truly heartbreaking. When they returned from the Children's Day service, the house was likely still holding the heat of the afternoon sun. We can imagine the scene. Josiah helping the younger boys into their pajamas, Sarah helping the Stillinger girls settle into the downstairs guest bed, and the muffled giggles of children sharing secrets before drifting off. By roughly 10 p.m., the last kerosene lamp was blown out, sending the house into a deep, Midwestern darkness. In a small town like Villisca in 1912, the night had a specific sound. It was the rustle of the corn in the distance and the occasional creak of a settling timber. But that night, the house on 2nd Street was harboring a silence that was far more sinister. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no splintered door frames, and most chillingly, not a single cry for help. It's a detail that baffles historians even today. How do 8 people, including 4 energetic children and 2 young guests, lose their lives without a neighbor hearing a single sound? The answer lies in the terrifying efficiency of the shadow moving through the halls. At some point during the night, something entered that home. Or perhaps, more accurately, something emerged from the crawlspace. Armed with Josiah's own long-handled axe, the intruder began a methodical, ghostly walk through the rooms. This wasn't a panicked attack. It was a slow, deliberate ritual. The killer moved from bed to bed, hidden by the velvet blackness of a house without electricity. In the medical autopsy reports that would follow, the sheer force used was described as overwhelming. Yet, the rest of the town slept on, completely unaware that the heartbeat of one of their most beloved families was being extinguished, one by one. The killer was so calm, so composed, that he took the time to cover the faces of his victims with their own linens, tuck them in as if they were merely resting, and then, in a display of pure psychological darkness, he went to the kitchen. Morning arrived with a cruel, bright cheerfulness. At 5 a.m., the sun began to peek over the Iowa horizon, but the Moore house remained a fortress of shadows. Mary Peckham, the neighbor we met earlier, stepped out to hang her laundry. She looked over at the Moore place, expecting to see the usual bustle of a Monday morning. But the porch was empty. The curtains were drawn tight, as if the house was squinting against the light. Even the family dog, usually a vocal presence in the yard, was nowhere to be seen. Mary waited. 6 o'clock passed. 7 o'clock. The milkman came and went, leaving bottles that sat untouched in the heat. A heavy, instinctive dread began to pool in Mary's stomach. In a tight-knit community, where everyone knew everyone's business, this level of stillness was a loud, screaming alarm. She walked to the edge of the property, peering at the windows, hoping to see a flickering lamp or a child's face. But there was only the reflection of the summer sky in the glass. No movement, no life. just a cold, sinking realization that the world had shifted while the town slept. Something wasn't right. At roughly 8:30 a.m., Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, arrived at the silent house on 2nd Street. He didn't come expecting a nightmare. He came because he thought his brother might just be sleeping in. He rattled the door handle, but it was locked tight, unusual for a man as welcoming as Joe. Ross pulled a spare key from his pocket, the metal clicking sharply in the morning air. As the door swung inward, the first thing that hit him wasn't a sound, but a feeling. The house was unnaturally cool, as if the walls were holding on to the darkness of the night before. The air was thick, smelling of old dust, and something faintly sweet, the scent of iron. Ross stepped into the parlor, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He noticed the curtains immediately. They hadn't just been pulled shut. They had been pinned together with clothing from the family's own laundry basket to ensure not a single ray of sunlight could peek inside. He walked toward the downstairs guest bedroom where the two Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina, had been sleeping. He pushed the door open, expecting to wake two groggy children. Instead, his heart plummeted. The girls were there, but they weren't moving. Their faces were completely covered by the bedsheets, tucked in with a terrifying, neat precision. Ross reached out, his hand trembling, and pulled back the corner of the linen. He didn't see the little girls he knew. He saw the brutal, jagged work of an axe. The impact had been so violent that the ceiling above the bed was stained with the evidence of the struggle. But it was the room itself that chilled him to the bone. Next to the bed, the killer had placed a 4-pound slab of bacon wrapped in a kitchen towel. Nearby, a bowl of bloody water sat on the dresser, where the intruder had calmly washed his hands before leaving. Every mirror in the house, every single piece of glass that could show a reflection, had been draped in gray cloth. It was as if the killer couldn't stand the thought of the victims looking back at him, or perhaps he didn't want to see the monster he had become. Ross stumbled back out into the hallway, his knees buckling. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His brother, his sister-in-law, and all 4 of his nieces and nephews were upstairs, and the silence from the 2nd floor told him everything he needed to know. He fell against the doorframe, the air escaping his lungs in a ragged, desperate sob. God, help me. The words hung in the stagnant air, unanswered. Ross ran from the house, screaming for the marshal, his voice shattering the morning peace of Villisca. The news spread through the town like a wildfire in a dry field. Within minutes, the sanctuary of small-town America was gone, replaced by a paralyzing, invisible fear. The house on 2nd Street was no longer a home. It was a monument to an impossible cruelty. And in that moment, everything changed. By noon, the quiet town of Villisca had turned into a hornet's nest of panic. Word had leaked out from the Moore house, and the news was so horrific that the human brain struggled to process it. 8 people? An axe? In a town where most people didn't even own a door key? But instead of the police cordoning off the area with yellow tape, something much more modern and disastrous happened. Curiosity, fueled by pure, unadulterated shock, overcame common sense. Before the regional investigators could even arrive by train, the crime scene, the most sacred piece of evidence in the state of Iowa, was absolutely obliterated. Hundreds of local townspeople, driven by a morbid need to see the impossible, swarmed the property. They didn't just stand on the lawn. They walked through the front door. They stood in the very rooms where the Moore children had spent their final moments. They touched the walls. They peered at the blood-stained ceilings, and they inadvertently wiped away the only fingerprints the killer might have left behind. It was a tragedy on top of a tragedy, a town, in its grief and confusion, accidentally helping a murderer escape. When Marshal Hank Horton finally managed to clear the house, the physical evidence he found was enough to make even a seasoned lawman feel sick. In the guest bedroom, leaning against the wall near the bed of the Stillinger girls, was the weapon, Josiah Moore's own long-handled axe. It was heavy, industrial, and covered in a dark, dried crust. The most terrifying detail? There was no forced entry, no broken locks, no jimmied windows. The killer didn't have to break in. He had either been invited, or he had simply walked through an unlocked door, moving like a ghost through a house that trusted the world too much. The frustration began to boil over as the sun beat down on the gathered crowds. The theory started flying like sparks. Was it a drifter who had hopped off the midnight train? Was it a jealous business rival? Every person in town suddenly had a story. One neighbor claimed they saw a strange man with a suitcase. Another swore they heard a low whistle coming from the woods. But as the doctors performed the grim task of the autopsies right there in the house, the medical facts only deepened the mystery. Each victim had been struck with the blunt end of the axe, not the blade, a choice that suggested a specific, focused rage. And yet, there was no robbery. Josiah's wallet was still there. Sarah's jewelry was untouched. There was no motive, no clear suspect, no fingerprints, just a house full of shadows and a town full of people who were suddenly looking at their own neighbors with eyes full of suspicion. The investigators paced the floors, looking at the covered mirrors and the slab of bacon on the floor, shaking their heads in total disbelief. The more they looked, the less they knew. The harder they searched, the further the truth seemed to drift away into the Iowa cornfields. None of it made sense. The initial shock of the slaughter soon hardened into something much darker, a suffocating paranoia. The town of Villisca was desperate for an answer, a face to put to the monster. As the chaos cleared, detectives found themselves staring at two very different, but equally chilling, shadows. First, there was State Senator Frank Jones. He was a wealthy, powerful figure, the kind of local giant who commanded the county with an iron grip. Jones and Josiah Moore had suffered a bitter, ugly falling out over their competing farm implement businesses. The rivalry was so toxic that dark whispers began to spread through the farming community. Did the powerful politician hire a rogue assassin to erase his rival? It was a cold, calculated theory, but for many, it lacked the twisted intimacy of the crime scene. Then, the spotlight violently shifted to a traveling preacher, the Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an erratic, deeply troubled man who had attended the very same Children's Day service as the Moores that Sunday evening. Even more disturbing, witnesses claimed they saw the Reverend on a train leaving Villisca early the next morning. He was reportedly pacing the aisles, rambling to confuse passengers about a terrible, bloody massacre hours before the bodies were ever discovered by Ross Moore. But as medical examiners and early criminal profilers dug deeper into the physical evidence, the true psychological horror of the crime began to take shape. This wasn't just a simple hit for hire. This was a nightmare built on terrifying patience. When investigators climbed into the cramped, sweltering attic of the Moore home, they found a detail that made their blood run cold. A pile of cigarette butts and a clear impression pressed into the floor dust. The killer hadn't just slipped in after the family went to sleep. The evidence suggested he had been hiding up there for hours. He had crouched in the dark heat, breathing the heavy summer air, listening to the children laugh downstairs. He listened to the parents read stories. He waited for the perfect, vulnerable silence to fall over the house. The medical timeline revealed something even more repulsive. The murderer didn't flee immediately after the final blow was struck. He stayed. He lingered in the suffocating house alongside 8 broken bodies. He calmly washed his hands in a basin. He wandered the halls. And then there was the staging. The killer methodically walked from room to room, gathering pieces of the family's own clothing to drape over every single mirror and reflective surface. It is a detail that still haunts criminal psychologists today. Was it a ritualistic superstition? A primal fear that the souls of the dead might be trapped in the glass? Or was it a sudden, crushing guilt? Perhaps the predator was so entirely consumed by the gruesome reality of his actions that he couldn't bear to catch his own reflection in the dim light. It felt entirely too personal, too theatrical. The realization slowly crept over the detectives as they stood surrounded by those shrouded mirrors. This isn't right. The town realized they weren't just looking for an angry business rival or a random drifter. They were hunting a phantom. A killer with a deeply fractured mind who had turned a family's sanctuary into a twisted psychological stage. And that changed everything. The American justice system thrives on the promise of closure. We rely on the courtroom to take our worst nightmares, dissect the evidence, and lock the monsters away. But for the devastated community of Villisca, that comforting resolution never arrived. Despite years of exhaustive investigations, countless grand jury hearings, and 2 highly publicized trials for the Reverend George Kelly, the legal system failed to deliver an answer. The jury simply could not agree. The crime scene, tragically trampled by hundreds of curious boots on that first frantic morning, was entirely compromised. Decades before the invention of DNA profiling or modern forensic psychology, the authorities were essentially left chasing smoke. Ultimately, every single suspect walked free. The investigation lost its momentum, growing cold and then entirely frozen. The tragedy shifted from a fresh, bleeding wound into a dark American legend. To this very day, the brutal slaughter of the Moore family and the young Stillinger sisters remains officially, frustratingly unsolved. Yet, the questions refuse to fade. They linger like a heavy fog over the Midwest. Why did the predator choose that specific, ordinary family? What deeply fractured mental state drove a human being to leave a slab of unrendered bacon next to a weapon, or to painstakingly shroud every reflective glass in the home? How did a killer inflict such overwhelming, catastrophic trauma without triggering a single scream? The passage of more than a century has only deepened the puzzle. The physical structure still stands quietly on East 2nd Street, a grim wooden monument holding on to the final moments of 8 innocent people. Perhaps the answers died with the original detectives. The truth may have been buried in the local cemetery, resting eternally beneath the Iowa soil. Or, even more terrifyingly, it was hidden in plain sight, masked by the friendly, everyday smile of a trusted neighbor. The police couldn't solve it, but the details still speak to us. Who do you think committed the Villisca murders? Drop your best theories and suspect profiles in the comments below, and let's discuss. The most deeply unsettling reality of this entire medical and historical anomaly is the absolute lack of an ending. The killer did not vanish into thin air. He wiped his hands, stepped out of that suffocating house into the bright morning light, and blended right back into the world. And whoever walked into that house that night may have walked away forever.